Colonial America was a vast land settled by Spanish, Dutch, French and English immigrants who established colonies such as St. Augustine, Jamestown, Roanoke and many others. Often these settlements displaced Native American societies that had preceded them by thousands of years. How St. Augustine became the first permanent European settlement in America. St. Augustine, Florida was founded by Spanish explorers long before Jamestown and the Plymouth Colony. Even before Jamestown or the Plymouth Colony, the oldest permanent European settlement in what is now the United States was founded in September 1565 by a Spanish soldier named Pedro Menendez de Aviles in St. Augustine, Florida. Menendez picked the colony's name because he originally spotted the site on August 28, the feast day of St. Augustine. Menendez's expedition wasn't the first group of Spanish explorers who tried to start a colony in Florida, which Juan Ponce de Leon had claimed for Spain back in 1513. And unlike other colonizers, he wasn't out to find gold or set up a trading network with the native tribes. Instead, Menendez's primary mission was simple: get rid of French Huguenot colonists who were trying to usurp the Spanish claim. The previous year, the French had established an outpost at Fort Caroline, near present-day Jacksonville. A French base in Florida posed a potential threat not just to Spanish territorial claims, but also to the Spanish treasure fleet that sailed from South America and Mexico along the Florida coast before heading across the Atlantic to Spain. Spain's King Philip II wanted the French threat eliminated, particularly because the settlers were Protestants and to Philip, a Catholic, that made them intolerable. Spanish colonists, outnumbered, get lucky. Menendez almost didn't succeed. Philip wanted him to destroy the French colony before France could send military forces to Florida to protect it. But by the time Menendez arrived in Florida in August 1565, he discovered that a force of French reinforcements had arrived before him. According to David Arbizu, an associate professor of Spanish at the University of South Florida and editor and translator of Pedro Menendez de Aviles, a new manuscript, an account of the expedition by Menendez's brother-in-law, Gonzalo Solis de Maras. He went up to the fort, by ship, where he discovered that the French had a very large fleet, Arbizu explains. So he retreated to a place that he had discovered the week before and had called St. Augustine, and waited for the French to attack. Menendez and his men were badly outnumbered and pretty much defenseless. But then nature dealt Menendez a lucky break. The French fleet appears and is prepared to crush the Spaniards, when at that exact moment, a large storm or hurricane blows the French fleet to the south and sinks them, saving the Spaniards from disaster, Arbizu explains. Instead of being slaughtered, all that Pedro Menendez had to do in the next couple of days was to walk up to Fort Caroline, which now had very few soldiers inside, and conquer it without even shedding a drop of Spaniards' blood, says Arbizu. It appears the enemy did not perceive their approach until the very moment of the attack, as it was very early in the morning and had rained in torrents. Francisco López de Mendoza Grajales, the expedition's chaplain, later wrote, "The greater part of the soldiers of the fort were still in bed. Some arose in their shirts, and others, quite naked, begged for quarters, but, in spite of that, more than 140 were killed." The chaplain praised Menendez for the ardent desire which he has to serve our Lord in destroying the Lutheran heretics, the enemies of our holy Catholic religion. Matanzas Inlet named for slaughter. When Menendez got back to his encampment at St. Augustine, local Indians told him about seeing white men walking on the beach south of St. Augustine. Pedro Menendez realizes that these are the Frenchmen who had been blown away in the storm, Arbizu explains. Menendez rushed to the location and found some shipwreck survivors, who had lost their weapons and food in the storm, according to a National Park Service account. Mendoza, the chaplain, asked for permission to offer the Frenchmen a chance to survive if they converted to Catholicism. 16 of them accepted, and the other 111 were killed. 2 weeks later, French commander Jean Ribault and his surviving men showed up on the beach as well. The Spanish force offered them the chance to surrender, and the French accepted. Menendez's men then bound them, and stabbed Ribault to death before executing the rest of their captives by beating them to death with clubs and hacking them with axes, as Jacques Lemoyne de Morgues, a French artist who heard about the killings from a sailor who had somehow escaped, later wrote. The inlet where the killings took place was named Matanzas, the Spanish word for slaughters. Had it not been for the hurricane, Pedro Menendez's expedition would have probably failed, as all the others before him, and Florida would have been a French colony, Arbizu says. St. Augustine becomes center for Spanish power in Florida. Instead, after the slaughter, the Spanish stayed in St. Augustine to establish a permanent colony to deter more French from settling. Philip's support for the effort in successfully establishing a lasting settlement were in large part due to the French presence, says Shane Mountjoy, provost of York College in Nebraska and author of St. Augustine, a 2007 history of the city. The Spanish soon realized St. Augustine offered a valuable base for rescuers to help their trading ships when they were battered by tropical storms, as well as for warships needed to hunt pirates. As a result, the colony was heavily subsidized by the Spanish crown. Another source of support was the Catholic Church, which saw an opportunity to convert the native population, and sent missionaries to accompany the Spanish soldiers. St. Augustine became a key center for Spanish power in Florida, which, in turn, made it a frequent target of attacks by the English and other enemies. In 1586, Sir Francis Drake raided and burned St. Augustine, but residents eventually came back and rebuilt it. In 1672, the Spanish erected Castillo de San Marcos, the oldest masonry fort in the continental United States that still stands watch over the city. Why did the Pilgrims come to America? They were less religious refugees than economic migrants. When the Pilgrims set sail from Europe in 1620, several powerful reasons propelled them across the Atlantic Ocean to make new lives in America, but religious liberty was not their most pressing concern. While it's popularly thought that the Pilgrims fled England in search of religious freedom, the separatists' quest had ended more than a decade before they boarded the Mayflower. After departing England in 1608, the Pilgrims found sanctuary in the Dutch city of Leiden, where they were free to worship and enjoyed much peace and liberty, according to Pilgrim Edward Winslow. The Pilgrims actually had no reason to leave the Dutch Republic in order to go to America to seek religious toleration because they already had it, says Simon Targett, co-author of New World Incorporated, The Making of America by England's Merchant Adventurers. Therefore, you have to look for other reasons as to why they might have risked the dangers of going across to the New World, and one of the big reasons was commercial. The Pilgrims' Dutch sojourn left them poor and disillusioned. Like tens of millions of newcomers who would follow in their wake to America, the Pilgrims were economic migrants. After working for more than a decade in Leiden's textile industry, the Pilgrims possessed little beyond their religious freedom. The former farmers lived in poverty, laboring long hours for low pay by weaving, spinning, and making cloth. The Pilgrims' economic hardship made it exceedingly difficult to convince their fellow separatists to join them in Leiden, no matter their religious rights. Some preferred and chose the prisons in England rather than this liberty in Holland with these afflictions, Pilgrim leader William Bradford recounted. As the Pilgrims' economic prospects further dimmed with the collapse of the wool market, the onset of the 30 Years' War in Europe and the imminent end of a 12-year truce between Spain and the Dutch Republic threatened the tranquility of their safe haven. While the Pilgrim population dwindled, their fears swelled that the secular Dutch society that tolerated their religious beliefs also corrupted the morals of their children, causing them to turn away from their church and English identity. Bradford complained that many of their children were succumbing to Leiden's manifold temptations and being drawn away by evil examples into extravagant and dangerous courses. The Pilgrims wanted their children to be English citizens, not Dutch citizens, Targett says. But if they were going to leave, they wouldn't be able to go back to England because of religious reasons. Pilgrim eyes, therefore, gazed across the Atlantic Ocean to America, where English merchants had been financing colonial settlements for decades. There they could freely worship, but also have greater economic stability and preserve their English identity. The Pilgrims also believed that the New World gave them the opportunity to evangelize to Native Americans and undertake, as Bradford wrote, the propagating and advancing the gospel of the kingdom of Christ in those remote parts of the world. The Pilgrims joined a money-making enterprise. Profit-seeking corporations launched England's first commercial outposts in America, such as the one established by the Virginia Company at Jamestown. Even to investors more interested in profits than profits, the Pilgrims made ideal candidates to launch a New World colony, given that they were close-knit, industrious and accustomed to hardship. After the Pilgrims received a patent from the Virginia Company to establish a settlement in its jurisdiction, a group of 70 London businessmen called the Merchant Adventurers supplied the capital to finance the enterprise by purchasing shares in a joint stock company. These backers paid for the Mayflower _ its crew and a year's worth of supplies. The merchant adventurers expected a return on their investment and required that the Pilgrims work for the company during their first 7 years in America. Each colonist over the age of 16 received 1 share for emigrating and working the land, which would be theirs along with any future profits after the expiration of the 7-year contract. In order to finance the voyage, the Pilgrims were forced to take aboard the Mayflower fellow economic migrants who shared their quest for commercial success, but not their separatist beliefs. These strangers, as the Pilgrims called them, accounted for half of the Mayflower passengers. When the strangers argued that they were no longer bound by the Virginia Company's charter after the Mayflower landed far north of its target in Massachusetts in November 1620, Pilgrim leaders drew up the Mayflower Compact to set the rules for self-governance and quell any potential rebellion. The Plymouth colony struggled to turn a profit. As a business enterprise, the colonial startup faced a beginning as rocky as the New England soil the Pilgrims were forced to sow. The Plymouth colony barely survived, let alone thrived, after a brutal first winter in America, and the Mayflower returned to England empty of commodities. It was a sign of things to come. The early investors were dissatisfied with what the Pilgrims sent home, Target says. They were meant to send back fur, timber, and fish, and on a couple of occasions the ships sent back either sank or were captured by pirates, so the investors never saw the benefits. The Plymouth colony finally gained its financial footing thanks to beaver pelts, which were in great demand back in England to make felt hats and other luxurious fashion accessories. The Bible and the beaver were the two mainstays of the young colony, wrote historian James Truslow Adams. The former saved its morale, and the latter paid its bills, and the rodents' share was a large one. The arrival of the Puritans and the establishment of the Massachusetts Bay Colony in the 1630s, however, increased the competition for beaver pelts and cut into the Pilgrims' bottom line. Not until 1648 did the Pilgrims pay off their debt. The Plymouth colony ultimately faced a similar fate to many struggling businesses. It was consumed by a larger, more successful corporate entity when it was merged with other colonies to form the province of Massachusetts Bay in 1691. 13 Everyday objects of colonial America. Early American colonists may not have had electricity, plumbing, or cars, but they found ways to make daily life easier with these objects. It should come as no surprise that people living in the original 13 colonies lived harder lives than contemporary Americans. But colonists still found ways to get their work done, make themselves a little more comfortable, and even have some fun. From farming implements to kitchenware to toys, these 13 objects were commonplace in homes during the colonial period. 1. Fire bucket. In the days before fire departments, the entire community was tasked with putting out fires. Few houses were without a fire bucket, made of heavy leather and kept by the front door. People lined up and passed the water-filled buckets from hand to hand to put out the blaze. Empty buckets were sent back along the line to be filled again. 2. Flail. This important farming tool consisted of 2 wooden sticks, a long handle and a shorter stick known as a swingle or swipe, joined by a leather strap, a rope, or a short chain. Colonial farmers used flails to beat or thresh wheat and other grains in order to remove the seeds and husks. 3. Bayberry, tallow, and whale oil candles. In the days before electricity, candles were a fixture in colonial homes. Many people made their own candles by boiling berries from the bayberry bush and skimming the thick greenish wax off the top. Farmers and hunters also collected and saved fat from animals to make tallow candles. But the brightest, longest-lasting, and most expensive candles were made from spermaceti, a waxy material found in the head of a sperm whale. 4. Wool cards. Most colonists didn't have access to, or couldn't afford, pre-made fabric, so they made their own, often from sheep's wool. A key part of this process was carding, which involved pulling the wool fibers back and forth between 2 thin, rectangular boards, cards, covered with wire teeth. Carding removed tangles and ensured that all the wool faced the same direction, making it easier to spin it into thread. 5. Hornbook. Though many boys learned to read and write from their parents or local ministers, and others received a more formal education, that wasn't considered necessary for girls. Many colonial-era children learned the alphabet, numbers, and other basics, like the Lord's Prayer, by using a hornbook, a sheet of paper mounted on a tablet of wood, leather, or bone, and covered by a thin strip of transparent horn. 6. Sampler. No well-brought-up young girl in colonial America would be without her sampler, the ubiquitous piece of embroidered cloth on which she practiced the basic skills of needlework. Samplers ranged from simple letters and numbers to poems, family records, and elaborate depictions of religious or pastoral scenes. 7. Whirligig. Without manufactured or electronic toys, many children played with games and toys made from common materials found around the house. The whirligig was a simple whirling toy made from a circular disc, made of bone, clay, or even a spare button, with a string threaded through its center. By pulling the string tight and releasing it, children could set the whirligig whirring and buzzing. 8. Pomander. This trick for making homes smell good actually dates back to medieval Europe. Its name comes from the French pomme d'ambre, meaning apple of amber. A piece of fruit, usually an orange, would be studded with cloves and rubbed with oils and spices to make it extra fragrant. Pomanders were often hung on ribbons and used as decorations, especially around the holidays. 9. Warming pan. Colonial-era homes could get brutally cold in the winter. Before getting in bed, people would sometimes heat the bedsheets by filling these circular metal pans with coal, inserting them into their beds, and moving it rapidly back and forth to avoid burning the sheets. When not in use, warming pans were often hung by the kitchen fireplace. 10. Salt cellar. At many colonial dinner tables, the salt cellar, or standing salt, served as a centerpiece. In a tradition brought over from medieval Europe, the salt cellar also indicated the status of the diners. Those seated above the salt, near the end of the table where the host and hostess sat, were the guests of honor. Children and less important guests sat in the middle or at the other end of the table, or below the salt. 11. Sugar nippers. Sugar, a relative luxury at the time, was often sold in loaves or cones that could weigh up to 10 pounds each. This tool, also known as sugar shears or sugar cutters, allowed people to cut small pieces off the cones to stir into their tea or grind using a mortar and pestle to make granulated sugar. 12. Trencher. When it came to setting the colonial table, one of the most important objects was the trencher. These thick, rectangular wooden dishes had hollowed-out spaces in the middle for food. Colonists ate directly from the simple plates, often with their hands, as utensils, other than spoons, didn't become commonplace until the 18th century. 13. Sundial. Watches and clocks were scarce in colonial America. Instead, most people relied on the sun to tell time. To track the sun as it moved across the sky from east to west, they used sundials. These ancient devices told time by the shadow of a pointer cast by the sun onto a metal plate marked with the hours, and were almost as accurate as the mechanical timepieces of the day. Alternatively, people would scratch marks into a window sill or threshold, indicating the position of the sun at noon. The Native American chief who drove out Spanish colonists and nearly expelled the English. Kidnapped and taken to Spain, Opechancanough used what he learned of the Europeans to lead his people against two of the world's greatest powers. In the summer of 1561, Spanish explorers abducted a Powhatan Indian youth from the Chesapeake Bay Tidewater region and brought him to the royal court of Spain. The kidnapping set off a chain of events that would alter the course of American colonial history. The abduction itself wasn't unusual, since the Spanish in America often trained native youth to serve as interpreters, or pressed them for information about local peoples and perhaps the whereabouts of gold or silver. But Paquiquinho, as Spanish officials rendered the young man's name later that year, would in time re-emerge as Opechancanough, the most formidable warrior chief encountered by Europeans in 16th and early 17th century Virginia. After returning to his homeland, he helped build the greatest chiefdom along the mid-Atlantic and spent the rest of his life defending his people from European invaders, whose mindset and strategies he had studied at close range. A brilliant tactician and charismatic leader, he successfully thwarted Spanish efforts to establish a Chesapeake settlement. And 50 years later, with his coordinated 1622 attack on the Jamestown colony, he came close to ending English colonial ambitions in the region. But while he stands as one of the greatest military leaders in early America, his achievements remain almost completely unknown. The Indian Prince and the Jesuits. Following his abduction, Paquiquinho, reputed to be the brother of Powhatan, principal chief of a confederacy of Algonquian-speaking tribes, was transported across the Atlantic to the court of King Philip II in Madrid. A deeply religious man, Philip oversaw an immense empire of recently conquered territory in the West Indies and Central and South America, whose indigenous peoples he considered heathens. He saw it as his sacred duty to convert them to Catholicism. The king believed Paquiquinho, intelligent and highborn, could help achieve that goal. Specifically, he might play a vital part in establishing a holy mission that would convert Indian peoples and facilitate Spanish settlement beyond Florida, the first major European territory claimed in North America. The Spaniards baptized and educated Pacuaquinho, honoring him with the princely Spanish name of Don Luis de Velasco, after the Viceroy of New Spain. In 1570, 9 frustrating years after his abduction, Pacuaquinho/Don Luis was returned to his homeland as part of a small Jesuit mission to the Chesapeake, intended as the prelude to Spanish colonization. With unshakable faith in Don Luis's piety and commitment to convert his people to Christianity, the missionaries allowed themselves to be led deep inland without armed support. But they'd been deceived. Within 6 months of landing, Don Luis led an Indian war party that killed all 8 Jesuits, sparing only a young servant boy. He completely destroyed the mission, and with it, the Spanish hoped to create future settlements in the Chesapeake Bay. Don Luis's motives for the betrayal aren't difficult to fathom. While living in Mexico City and Florida in the years before returning to his own land, he'd seen firsthand how Spanish conquest and conversion to Catholicism had destroyed Indian ways of life and beliefs. He knew if he let Jesuits establish a beachhead in the Chesapeake, more soldiers and settlers would follow, eventually taking the land and destroying his people. Virginia's First Indian Wars. As one of a very select few Native Americans who had traveled across the Atlantic and returned, Don Luis understood better than his peers the grave, looming threat Europeans posed, whether from Spain or elsewhere. His awareness likely played a major role in encouraging his brother, Chief Powhatan, to begin building a massive chiefdom encompassing more than 30 different tribal groups, which would be able to mount an effective defense against Europe's powerful invaders. From the mid-1570s to the early 17th century, the chiefdom, called by the Powhatan Indians Tsenacamaca, expanded rapidly across coastal Virginia. By the time English colonizers arrived, it reached from south of the James River to the shores of the Potomac River. In May 1607, 104 Englishmen set up camp on the banks of the James River on land they called Jamestown, but which actually belonged to the Paspahegh people. At first, relations with people along the river were cordial, if sometimes uncertain. But as more settlers arrived, including women and children, relations deteriorated, eventually leading to full-scale hostilities. The First English-Powhatan War played out along the James River Valley between the winter of 1609 and the spring of 1614, at which point the English had established settlements all along the river. Effectively beaten, Powhatan was quickly replaced by his war chief, who the English called Opichancanno, pronounced Opicancanno, but who the Indians knew as Pacuaquinho and the Spanish as Don Luis. The massive 1622 attack on Jamestown. Opichancanno, applying lessons learned in his encounters with the Spanish, adopted a very different strategy than his brothers, one that avoided pitched battles with well-armed English soldiers. Instead, he reassured the English of his good intentions and held out the likelihood his people would convert to Protestantism. Taking this approach, he successfully duped the colony's leadership as well as most settlers, allowing him to forge alliances and gather men to launch one of the most devastating Indian attacks on Europeans in American history. In the early dawnlight of a chilly March morning in 1622, groups of Powhatans gathered in the fields and woods near English settlements and waited patiently for a signal. When it came, they began walking towards the settlers' houses, seemingly in no great hurry. Since many had been trading with English families for years, dropping by when they had something to barter or share or borrow, nothing appeared out of the ordinary. Once inside the settlements, however, at about 8 a.m., Opichancanno's warriors fell violently upon the English, not sparing either age or sex, man, woman or child, Edward Waterhouse, a contemporary, wrote. Following initial attacks, more warriors, anywhere from 50 to a few hundred, joined the fighting to finish off survivors, burn settlements and slaughter livestock. A bird's-eye view would have revealed destruction and mayhem all along the James River, sheets of flames consuming houses, farm buildings, wharves and boats, dense columns of smoke billowing up from burning plantations and slaughtered livestock. Coming into sharper focus, men would have been seen grappling one another in desperate hand-to-hand combat, Indians hurling themselves upon the English, killing them in their homes, yards and fields. The screams of the dying and injured would have been clearly audible all along the river, together with the yells of warriors, shouts of alarm from settlers, the crack of musket fire and clash of steel. So sudden and unexpected was the attack, few settlers glimpsed the weapon that brought them to their end. On that fatal day, approximately 350 English men, women and children, a quarter to a third of the entire colony, died, clubbed, stabbed or shot to death with their own tools and weapons. Opechancanough did not expect a single day's attack, even such a well-executed one, would succeed in expelling the English from his lands immediately. Over the next few months, while the English reeled from the disaster, warriors continued to raid and plunder settlements. Amid a scene of utter desolation, the sense of dread was palpable. God forgive me, William Capps, an established tobacco planter, observed, "I think the last massacre killed all our country, and, besides them they killed, they burst the heart of all the rest." Settlers began abandoning their homesteads, seeking refuge at better protected plantations nearby, foreshadowing Governor Sir Francis Wyatt's general order of late April to evacuate all outlying settlements and move to 8 well-fortified locations along the James River. Local leaders even considered transporting the English to the eastern shore, where Indians remained on good terms with the settlers, to reduce further losses. The English kept coming. Meanwhile, Opechancanough continued planning. In the summer of 1622, he sent messengers with gifts to the chief of the Patawamecs, a powerful people living on the Potomac River, urging him to join his war against the settlers, boasting that before the end of 2 moons there should not be an Englishman in all their countries. By destroying plantations and industrial sites and cutting off food supplies, he believed they could render the English so weakened and demoralized they would either eventually fall victim to his warriors or be forced to flee the colony. Ultimately, the great chief's strategy failed. The English kept coming, despite their terrible losses from war, famine, and disease. Opechancanough simply didn't have sufficient warriors to counter wave after wave of new arrivals from across the Atlantic. Within a few years, the English had recovered from what they called the barbarous massacre and began establishing settlements across the region, beating back Indian peoples as they moved inexorably north and west. Driven by bitterness and despair, Opechancanough managed to inspire another generation of warriors to rise up against the English in the mid-1640s, killing approximately 500 settlers before he was captured and taken to Jamestown. There, nearly 100 years old, he was shot in the back by one of his guards and died. Compared to the warrior chiefs of the 18th and 19th centuries, Pontiac, Tecumseh, and Sitting Bull, little scholarly attention has been given to the Powhatan Wars of the early 17th century and Opechancanoug's leading role in them. Yet it was he, in the guise of the pious convert Don Luis, who limited the expansion of Spanish settlement along the eastern seaboard of North America, and he who resisted English settlement in Virginia for nearly half a century. His extraordinary life, battling 2 of Europe's greatest powers, confirms him as one of the greatest military leaders in American history.